You're watching the legal breakdown. So, Glenn, Trump has now been hit with a gag order in the Washington, D.C. case. How consequential is this gag order against him?
It's pretty significant. Donald Trump has been gagged. He can now not speak about the witnesses. He can't speak about the court staff. He can't speak about Jack Smith or his team, his staff. He can't reference the subject matter of the testimony of witnesses. And Brian, how quickly do you think Donald Trump will violate the gag order Judge Chutkan just imposed on him? I'll give it a day or two, and then the big ticket question will become, okay, what happens next? But today was a serious win for the rule of law. It was a serious win for the integrity of the criminal justice system and the prosecution against Donald Trump. And, it goes a long way to protecting witnesses, at least moving forward against Donald Trump's dangerous and sometimes deadly rhetoric.
Well, Glenn, for this next question, I'll just pull this one out of thin air, but what happens when Trump violates this gag order?
Great question. So they discussed today, I was in the courtroom today, they discussed what sanctions might be imposed, what might be available. And the following sanctions were mentioned: financial penalties, home detention, criminal contempt, and revocation of pretrial release. In other words, sitting Donald Trump in a jail cell pending trial. All of those are on the table. I think they are all well within the realm of possibilities. I do think when Donald Trump first violates the pretrial release conditions, the gag order, it will be a lower level punishment, maybe a financial penalty, which of course he'll just grift off his base. He's already fundraising off the gag order, but I think it will pretty quickly escalate up to and including pretrial detention. In fact, John Lauro, Donald Trump's criminal defense attorney, actually said at one point, okay, so Judge, what are you going to do? Put Donald Trump in a jail cell? And Judge Chutkan just kind of sat back and let that hang in the air. Here's the other important thing when we're discussing what might happen when Donald Trump violates this order. At the very end of the hearing, the judge said, in the event there's a violation, the prosecutors can certainly file a motion with the court for what's called a show cause order. That is something that requires a defendant to come into court and show cause why he didn't violate a condition set by the court and why he shouldn't be sanctioned for that violation. She said, the prosecutors can file that motion. Plus, I will be sua sponte policing this issue.
Which
Now,
means she could bring it up herself.
She used the term sua sponte, fancy lawyer's term for I am going to initiate it on my own if I see a reason to. I'm paraphrasing what she said, but when she said sua sponte, she was sending a message that I may not even wait for the prosecutors to file a motion or to put me on notice that there's a possible violation of my gag order. I'm going to be looking at it sua sponte. And I would say, knowing Judge Chutkan from having tried murder cases against her back in the day, Donald Trump better not test her resolve.
And it's probably doubly as concerning for Trump's team because we've seen how Jack Smith is probably erring more on the side of cautiousness anyway, and so he would probably be unlikely to bring forward some motion to impose sanctions or even pretrial detention. But if she's setting off that that if she's shooting off that shot across the bow now, showing that she'll do it herself, then that shows that Jack Smith's timidity in this case isn't even going to be an issue.
Yeah, and I don't know that Jack Smith and timidity are two things that I often put together, but I will say he has been reluctant to go scorched earth after, for example, Judge Aileen Cannon for being partial to Donald Trump. He hasn't touched that. And he hasn't expressly said to Judge Chutkan he's already violated some conditions of release that were set for him previously when he was arraigned.
Right.
The magistrate judge told him in no uncertain terms, the most important condition of your pretrial release is that you not commit any state, federal, or local crimes. And then he chilled the testimony of a witness down in Georgia, told that witness, you shouldn't testify before the grand jury, which violates Georgia state law. Jack Smith has been surprisingly silent on that. So I don't know that I'd go with timidity, but I'll tell you, he really does want his ducks in a row before he goes hard after Donald Trump.
Well, Glenn, I gotta say, within hours of this gag order being handed down on Trump, Donald Trump came out during one of his rallies, I believe in Iowa, and he lashed out at Judge Chutkan herself. Here's a clip of that.
A judge gave a gag order today. Did you hear that on speech? Which I believe is totally unconstitutional, what she did. A judge gave a gag order. A judge doesn't like me too much. Her whole life is not liking me. But she gave a gag order. You know what a gag order is? You can't speak badly about your opponent. But this is weaponry all being done because Joe Biden is losing the election and losing very, very badly to all of us.
Glenn, did anything there violate this gag order?
Yeah, great question, Brian. I'm going to say probably not. So the judge said that Donald Trump is prohibited from talking about the judge's staff, the court staff. She didn't expressly say, you can't say anything derogatory about me. But even if she did, I don't think Donald Trump saying the judge takes me her whole life, which of course is absolute nonsense, would really constitute a violation of the gag order that she did impose today. Interestingly, Donald Trump also expressly and directly lied about the gag order that Judge Chutkan just imposed. She specifically said, you are not being gagged from talking about Joe Biden, even calling him crooked Joe Biden. You're not being gagged, from talking about your opponent in this race for the presidency. And yet he just lied to the crowd, saying a gag order says you can't speak about your opponent. Now, is lying about the terms of the gag order a violation of the gag order? I think the answer is probably not. However, it's all going to go into the bucket of Donald Trump badness, and all of this is going to come back to haunt him when ultimately he does directly violate the gag order by, for example, talking about one of the witnesses. And then I think all of this will be helpful atmospherics and window dressing to show why Donald Trump is unwilling or unable to generally comply with conditions of release set by the court.
Yeah, that's a great point. Glenn, he's already going out and his team is already going out and saying that this is all unconstitutional because it all breaches his First Amendment rights. So first off, can you explain how the First Amendment can be curbed in deference to the administration of justice and to protect witnesses?
Yeah. So the First Amendment is not absolute, particularly as it applies to somebody who is on release pending trial, because that person is subjected to the conditions set for them by the court to protect the orderly administration of justice, to protect the jury pool from being tainted, to protect the witnesses who are expected to testify at trial. And the judge said this over and over again in today's hearing. The First Amendment is not absolute, particularly for somebody on pretrial release. So the First Amendment claim sounds good, but all sorts of constitutional rights actually can and do yield when you are a charged defendant in a federal felony case on release pending trial. For example, a judge can impose a curfew. The judge can tell you, you can't go out of your house after 8 p.m. Well, if you were not in a pretrial status, a judge or a government official could never impose that kind of restraint on your movement. The same holds true with the First Amendment. It yields to the extent that the judge has a responsibility to ensure a free trial untainted by statements made by a defendant. And the Supreme Court has made that clear over and over again.
Perfectly put. Glenn, we've all heard the whole litany of Trump's best hits by now. So we know what he's going to say about Joe Biden's weaponized DOJ, about the crime-infested city of Washington, D.C., about corrupt Jack Smith. Given this new gag order, what can and what can't he say now?
He cannot make statements about the witnesses. He can't comment on their anticipated testimony. He can't make statements about Jack Smith or his staff. He can't make statements about the court staff the way he did up in New York when he endangered Judge Engoron's clerk by posting or reposting a picture of the clerk taken with Senator Chuck Schumer and lying and saying, oh, this is Senator Schumer's girlfriend. She's running the case against me in New York. Therefore, the case must be dismissed. I mean, he cannot say anything like that. You know, how long before he tests those waters and begins to push boundaries is anybody's guess. But here's something that Judge Chutkan said that was both true and pretty disheartening. It specifically had to do with something he has now been prohibited from saying. She referred to his posts, his persistent posts about special counsel Jack Smith being a deranged thug. He is no longer permitted to say those kind of things under this gag order. But she posed this question, Brian. She said, how many defendants on pretrial release could say the person prosecuting them is a deranged thug and not immediately end up in pretrial detention, have their release revoked? And the answer was pretty clear. Nobody, except Donald Trump. And unfortunately, this is the disheartening part. Even what she was laying out highlights the unequal application of the law. It highlights how Donald Trump enjoys so many more benefits than no other criminal defendant pending trial would enjoy. And that is just a sad reality of how our institutions of government have been handling the task of prosecuting a criminal former president of the United States.
Even as all the while he presents himself as the biggest victim that's ever stepped foot in a courtroom. So that's the ultimate irony of all of this. Glenn, was there any memorable moments from the courtroom while you were there, aside from what we've spoken about thus far?
Yeah, there were a few, and I haven't heard anybody talk about this. I haven't yet seen it reported, though it may have been reported. Twice during the hearing, Judge Chutkan reached back in history and used what is a fairly well-known saying. She said, and she was referencing Donald Trump's posts about, slimy Bill Barr and Mike Pence and Brad Raffensperger and Chairman Milley, given some of what he's done, should be put to death. She was referencing all these sort of thinly veiled calls to violence by Donald Trump. And she said, so it's kind of like the saying, who will rid me of this meddlesome priest? Now, I had to refresh myself. I'm not the biggest student of history, but this is something that was said by King Henry II about Thomas Becket, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, King Henry did not come right out and say, I want Thomas Becket hurt. No, what he said is, who will rid me of this meddlesome priest? And she used that to analogize to Donald Trump saying, Jack Smith, the person prosecuting me, is a deranged thug. She then drew the direct connection. She said to the defense attorney for Donald Trump, what should one do with a deranged thug? Get him off the streets, right? So, she was using that historical reference to say Donald Trump might not come right out and say, hurt the witnesses against me, but the signal he sends is unmistakable.
Yeah, it's kind of a shame too that she wasted such an intelligent analogy on the Trump team and in all their infinite wisdom over there. So with that said, we'll obviously stay on top of all of this, including if and when Donald Trump violates this gag order and what will happen as a result of that. So for anybody watching, if you want to stay on top of this stuff, make sure to subscribe. The links are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.